Hello there. In this video I'm going to show you how you can use some of the additional curves that are available on the curves menu in Fluid Designer for 3D printing. So if you start off Fluid Designer, I'm going to use this 20mm hexagonal pendant as the outlying object. So if I just drag and drop that onto the workspace. Now I do need to open up the Toolbox panel here, so you can either press T on the keyboard or you can drag the window open. And what we're going to do is we're going to have a look at some of the curve options that are available here. And I'm going to start off by selecting the option to add an Enneper curve. And if I just zoom in, and if I just rock the screen there, you can see what we've got. Now, the thing about these curve objects is that they are three-dimensional, and it is possible, obviously, to print an object that's three-dimensional, provided that the curve itself is connected, is touching the pendant. So let's have a look at how we can make that happen. Well, if we look over in the Toolbox panel here, there are some values that you can adjust. So for example, we can change the height. So we could make this much higher. All I'm doing is clicking on the bar here and dragging the mouse to the right and then to the left. You can, of course, just click on the end of the bars to change that. I'm actually going to take it down to 0, and you see, well, I'm going to type in 0 there because it went below 0. You can see that what happens at 0 is you get this more flat appearance. Okay, so that's what I'm going to do with the height, but there's nothing to stop you adding some depth to this. Now if we click on scale and increase that, you can see that the effect of it is to scale the object, and it's now sort of filling up inside of the pendant. Now before I go too far with that, let's have a look at some of the other values, the P and the Q. Well, if I click on P, you can see my pattern changes, and similarly, well, not in this instance, we're not getting any change in Q. That's probably because we've got no height. If we put some height back in, you can see the Q changing, but with no height you don't actually see any variation with the Q. So in this instance, because we're doing it as flat, we don't need to change the Q. We can just change P until you get a pattern that you quite like. Now, there are limits to how far you can go here, because we're producing a pendant, which, you know, in real life is a very tiny object like that. There are limits in what can be 3D printed. Now, down in geometry options, this bevel is set to be 0.5. Now what that does is the bevel is actually the radius of this. So 0.5 radius gives us a thickness here of 1mm, and we can measure that with the interactive ruler. Now you don't really want to be going much lower than that. I mean, you can, especially if you've got a really fancy 3D printer, but in general terms, if you're printing at somebody like Shapeways, you want to stick to something like 1mm, which is why this value has been set for you. Now, in terms of fine detail that can be printed, you can't see a hole that's much below 0.5 millimeter, so you would be able to still see that hole if you 3D printed it. If I just press the escape key to come out of that, don't think, yeah. So if we keep increasing P, these things here, these shape, we're not going to see that. We're not going to get, certainly not going to get the hole that's there, because that's just far too tiny to be seen when 3D printed. So as we start going up higher and higher, clearly you can see that the pattern isn't going to work very well. Those gaps would probably be okay, just about though, because that's 0.4, so you probably just see a hole there. You certainly see the hole in the middle. But that's pretty much all you get. So you do have to be a little bit careful. You do need to stick to relatively low numbers here for the patterns, just on the basis that this is a pendant in a really tiny object. If you were actually printing something like a coaster, for example, to put your cup of coffee on, then you could create something that's much bigger in size, and you can in that instance use much bigger values of P. So something like that, for example, may well be okay. So if I just measure that, yeah, that's about 0.5. So those holes you could see in an object that's of that sort of size. Now we're not looking at objects of that sort of size. We want to scale right down to fit inside the pendant here. So we are going to have to restrict ourselves to relatively low values of P. Now when you've got a pattern that you're happy with, do go to View and Top View, and I'll just press the Home key on the keyboard and just zoom in again. Now I want to scale this until it just touches the outline pendant itself. Now if you wanted a rounded section on the inside of this, you would need to go to Tools, Object Tools, and convert that to a mesh, and then highlight the pendant itself and go to Tools, Object Tools, and convert that to a mesh, and then highlight the pattern in the center, hold down the Shift key, highlight the outlying pendant, and join them together. So we now have one object there which we could 3D print, and in this instance the inner pattern is rounded in cross section, whereas the pendant itself is rectangular. It's 1 by 2. If I do Control Z, Control Z, Control Z, and just keep going back until everything is grey again. Okay, so I'm back now to curves. The pendant itself is still a curve. The pattern inside is still a curve. And if I highlight the pattern first, and then hold down the Shift key and highlight the pendant, and then if I join them, notice that the pattern in the center takes on the same cross section as the pendant itself. So you need to decide, what kind of appearance that you want for that. Now, because these are still curves, we could still change the bevel object. Where's my panel not opening up here? My toolbox window doesn't seem to want to open for... Oh yes, there it is, it's opening now. So if I change the bevel object from 1 by 2 to 1 by 1, you can see I could change the thickness of the entire pendant. If you do that, make sure that it is still overlapping here, because that's very important from the point of view of the object being 3D printable. So, or you could change it to 3 millimeters thick, for example. But I'm going to leave it as 2. Now, when you do use these curve functions that are available here, do keep an eye on the number of faces at the top here. This is 390,000 faces. If you're printing at someone like Shapeways, you need to keep it below the million count. But what this will do is give you a smooth, high quality finish. So if I just go to File and New, I'm not going to actually save this object in this instance. If I drag and drop my hexagonal pendant onto the screen again and open up my toolbox, let me just have a look at another one of these. Let's see, what shall I try? I'll try the tennis seam one. Now you can see over here we get a similar set of parameters that we can change. I wouldn't recommend generally that you change the resolution or that you change the bevel resolution. This is set, if I zoom in, the bevel resolution is set to the highest value of 4. If I move that down to 0, you can see that the appearance of the object changes, the number of faces will be reduced. This is not, when you put bezel resolution down to 0, you don't get a very rounded, smooth surface. So I've set it up at 4 for you, so that you get a nice, smooth surface. Now there is a downside to that, you get a lot of faces, but generally speaking with jewellery items you want smooth finishes, so that's why this is set at 4. I said with the previous object that the 0.5 here, the bevel of 0.5, that represents the radius here, so the thickness again of this one is still 1 millimeter, and it's been set at that so that you can observe the real size of it when you join it to the pendant. And resolution of 10 down at the bottom here, again I would stick to that. I wouldn't increase or decrease it. I mean, you can play around, but I wouldn't. Now extrude is an unusual feature, and it does that. That's what extrusion is, and you could play around with extrusion, but it will vary from object to object. So if you want a more unusual pattern, you can use the extrude to create, as you can see, quite unusual a pendant. I'll set the extrude back to 0, and the P and Q, as was the case with the Enneper, you can modify those and you will get different patterns. But you do need to be aware, if you go too high with these, whoops, no, that's going much too big for my pendant. Yeah, you do need to be aware of the fact that you're not going to be able to see a hole that's anything less than 0.5 millimeter. That's 1 millimeter, so that'll work fine. But this is sticking outside now, so how do we get it to fit back in? Well, we can use the scale, and the scale will bring it back in, and we can adjust this until it's just touching the outline of the pendant, because you do need that overlap. But as you can see, this object has got some height to it, so if you want this kind of three-dimensional height, you can leave the height as 6. If you want to make it smaller, you can move it, adjust the value and slim it down, or if you enter in 0, you'll end up with a very flat shape there. Now, like any kind of curve, if you press the tab key, let me just go to view and top. If you press the tab key, you can go into edit mode. Now, as you can see, there are a lot of control points here, and if I press C on the keyboard and select those control points in the middle of the screen there, and then press escape to cancel circle select mode, if I pull the arrow to the right, you can see I can make some changes to my curve, my tennis seam curve, and I can adjust it to the right and down and to the left. Now, this hole will probably appear in your pendant. This hole over here is probably going to be way too small. Yeah, it's 0.2 of a millimeter. You wouldn't be able to see that size of the hole if you 3D printed this. Okay, so you would get some of this pattern. You would get this hole and this hole. You wouldn't get that hole there, and you probably wouldn't get this patination on the top either, because the detail is just too much to be seen. It would of course depend upon the resolution of the 3D printer. Okay, so you can go into edit mode and modify the pattern by moving control points. So most of these work in a similar sort of way, and you can play around with them, adjusting the various values that are there to see what you come up with. In general, if I just delete that object, in general, what you really need to do is to keep these values relatively small so that you do get patterns that will look reasonably good when 3D printing. And as I've said, the key is to look for a hole that's 0.4. That one probably will be okay. In general, you don't want to go much less than 0.5 for you to be able to see the hole when it's 3D printed. So that's the thing to take into account. Okay, so that's it for this this video. Thank you.